Good evening. Happy indeed for all of you to be here with us. Be turning to Mark chapter 4. That's where we're going to work out of tonight. We have, tonight is the 12th installment of our lesson on miracles. Last week, I believe it was last week, last week, maybe the week before, we said it was a miracle that it's the widow of Nain. It only happened in one account. This is one, though, a story that I think all of us will be familiar with, talking about Jesus stilling or calming the storm. You'll see it referred to as both stilling or calming. Either way works for me, and hopefully well. But we're going to talk a little bit about this miracle. Again, not a lot of information. You will have, I think, 2 quotes from Jesus in the entirety of this. I think there's 3. There's 1 at the very front end and 2 at the very back, but not a whole lot. But as we have done throughout our series of lessons, we're going to try and focus on some other things within it as well. So let me start by asking, does anybody here have a boat? Anybody here have a boat? Nobody. Well, probably need Kevin to be here. Who was? You got a boat? I'm sorry, Pat. I didn't see you over there. Will does have 2 remote control boats for the swimming pool. I don't know. The kayak, that would work. Well, none of those are going to work for what we're going to talk about. But we are going to talk a little bit about boats during the time period, because we sometimes see in the Bible, and this lesson is a good example of, they'll say that so-and-so went in a boat or stood in a boat or they got in a boat. And I think for a lot of us, when I hear boat, I think about, a boat that we would take out on a lake. And it's like, well, that doesn't jive with, what Jesus probably was on. It's probably not the same thing as a bass boat that they're going to take out today. So we're going to maybe see, and I hope that as we went through some of these, that it's helped you sort of see and understand a little bit about what the people had back then as well. But we're talking about Jesus calming or stilling the storm. There's a couple of things that I want to look at. We've talked a bit about the Sea of Galilee. I think this is maybe the 3rd time that we've had a picture of the Sea of Galilee of some form or fashion on here, in part because that's where Jesus lived, and most of Jesus's early work centered in and around the Sea of Galilee. And so this was a sort of a location that made sense for people. If you were to tell somebody where you lived, odds are they might not know where that is. But if you were to say it's close to ... that's a relative location, and that helps us to be able to understand, okay, here's where it was. Well, Jesus's relative location was near the Sea of Galilee for much of his ministry. And so a lot of what takes place there, I feel like it's important for us to sort of understand that as well. First of all, Sea of Galilee lies in a deep basin over 6 feet below sea level. And so it's very deep. Not necessarily the water's deep, although there's areas of the water that's deep as well. But when we talk about something being below sea level, if you were standing at the ocean, that's sea level. Well, if you're standing on the beach at the ocean, what is the land almost immediately going to do if you're looking back into land? Go up or go down? It's going to go up. So the farther you are away from the ocean, the sea level is going to rise. And if you go up into the mountains, it's real high. But in some places, it dips down. Well, this is not a great map, but it'll show it a little bit. If this is the Sea of Galilee, what do you notice that's all around it? Mountains, okay? There's mountains. It's a little hard to see, but there's these high ridges, these hills that completely circle around it. In those hills, there's ravines and gorges, and they all sort of flow down into the sea. This picture might help a little better. If this is the land is like right behind it. It's very rocky. It's mountainous, and all of these sort of crevices that are therein. Well, in some of those crevices, you've got water that flows down into it. But in all of those crevices, you've got wind that comes down through it. And when that wind gets whipping down through there, it's almost like a funnel, right? If you think about if you can sort of funnel something in, think about pouring gas into a lawnmower or something, you run it through a funnel. It's narrowing it down, but it's shooting it straight into this one spot. Well, that's what a lot of the wind does on the Sea of Galilee. Why is that important? Well, these are cool winds that blow down over the water, and they sometimes create violent tempests or raging seas. Now, I don't know that we would call a raging sea like something you'd see on the ocean, but the sea can get up pretty quick. And this wind that funnels it down can knock you around pretty good. Now, the boats that they're on, and we're going to talk a little bit about that more here in a second as we go forward. Do you want to be on one of these boats when one of these storms comes up? Well, that's a question that you can think about as well. They were sudden, frequent, and they were very dangerous to small boats. Okay, very dangerous to small boats. And within minutes, it becomes misty, and there's and what's normally a calm, peaceful water is like a cauldron of sorts. So this wind, this geography of it sort of causes this lake to be very calm, and then just like that to be very dangerous. And so when we read about people like Peter and Andrew and James and John, and we say they were fishermen, well, I think sometimes we get this image of fishing poles sitting on the side of the bank. Well, we talked a little bit about what they used, but these were dangerous jobs. They were jobs that when you're out fishing, we talked about this a few weeks ago, if you don't catch anything, you don't make any money. But if you're out there trying to catch something and one of these storms comes up, you're faced with a difficult task, right? What are your options if one of these storms comes up while you're out there fishing? Go to the shore, but what's the problem when you go to the shore? You have no catch, right? But what if you stay out there? You may get, the ship may sink. So they were in, it was a challenging and difficult sort of thing. But I want you to see a little bit about that. Well, yes, sir. Uh-huh. Yeah. Right. Right. Yep. That's Glacier National Park in Montana. But if you're on that water, if you're on the shore of it, everything around it is mountains. And it's the same sort of principle right there. So our story tonight in Mark chapter 4 is Jesus stilling this storm. And so just a real quick hitter on it. One day we see Jesus set in a boat and taught parables to the people who were gathered on the shore. Kind of a distance yourself a little bit, but you can see more people, right? So you take the boat out just to the edge of the water, but you can talk back to the people. Evening comes, he sends the multitude away, gets into this ship, and they're going to cross over to the other side. We talked about last week how that the Sea of Galilee was sort of divided in two. There was sort of a Jewish side and there was a Gentile side where people lived on one side or the other. And as they're sailing, one of those storms comes up. This is a man-made, obviously man-made, but a recreation. That's the word I'm trying to go for. A replica, maybe that's the better word, of the type of boat that they would have been on. So I want you to see that because we're going to look at a couple other things as well. So if you look at the size of that boat, if you look at the width of that boat, how would you describe what we think we're seeing? Fairly small, right? How many of you, well, first of all, how many of you don't much care for getting on a boat? All right. So Lucille, you don't want to get on this one? How many of you don't mind getting on a boat? But this one is a little small, right? Well, we'll see about how big it is. I hope you can see this. I have a couple of things for us to look at, but this is an artist rendition of this, okay? So when we look at it, just a few different things about a first century Galilean fishing boat. This is the type of sailboat it says you would have been very common, Jesus would have used, okay? Or the people that his disciples more than him would have used. As you can see, we talked a bit about nets and all of that. These people would have been working through there. Those nets were weighted. You cast the net out into the water. Then you have to retrieve the net there as well. Some of this time required that fishermen, dive into the water. Sometimes that meant that they worked without clothing, which makes sense because if you're going to be weighted down, it's going to be hard to get in and out of the water. And if you're getting in and out of the water a lot, it's just a lot easier not to have any clothing on. On a ship, this part right here, it's the stern. That'll come in important here in just a second whenever we're reading the story. But more than anything, I want you to look at these. This average size boat was about 26 feet in length. A delivery truck is about 27 feet in length. So if you can imagine a delivery truck, not a tractor trailer or anything like that, but a delivery truck. A school bus, about 37 feet in length. So about 2/3 to 3/4 the size of a school bus is about how big this boat would have been. And probably maybe the same width, okay? Does that change anybody's opinion on whether I'd get in the boat or not? It's pretty small. So Lucille says she likes the fact that it's kind of flat. I mean, there's stuff underwater, so I understand that. What were you going to say? Right. Sure. Right. So this is sort of what it would have looked like. Now, oddly enough, in 1986, there was a discovery on the Sea of Galilee of what is called either the Sea of Galilee boat or the Jesus boat. That's a name that's been given to it. As you can see, the picture looks about the same. Here's the Sea of Galilee. It was discovered in 1986 by a couple of fishermen. There had been a severe drought, and when this drought had come, there was a lot of exposed area of the sea that had been underwater, and people started to see it. This is what they found. Now, obviously, it's been withered away. It's been broken down, so it's not as good looking as it was a minute ago. But let's see. It was primarily cedar planks and oak frames there as well. It could hold about 15 people on it, plus 5 crews, so 15 to 20 people could have been on there. Now, think about that boat that we looked at and then put this whole side of the church into it there as well. All right, be a little snug in there, right? They were primarily for fishing. They might have carried passengers and goods. You can see there a little bit. But why would a boat like this not be a great boat for transporting items across the sea? Not big enough. I mean, it took a lot of trips to get the stuff across. And so it was fine for fish, but it wouldn't have been great if you're trying to move items, products all the way across. So you can see a little bit about this. This one, 26.5 feet, 7.5 feet wide, about 4.5 foot draw or 4.5 foot depth there within it. It is believed to have been built sometime between 100 BC and 100 AD. So a roughly 200-year period, that the same general time frame that Jesus was on earth. I like they've included this. Jesus and his followers may have used this type of boat, but I was reading something else that said this is not meant to say this was Jesus's boat, but they call it the Jesus boat because it would have been very common for them. Who knows who would have been in this? But I wanted you to get a sense of what they're going to be in tonight, because our title is Stilling or Calming the Storm. Would you have wanted to be in one of these boats when a big storm came up on the sea? I think I got almost every head. Even those of you that said I'm okay with being in a boat, got a lot of no's on whenever this happens. Now, one other thing, and I know I'm promising you we're going to get to the actual Bible lesson, but there's only 7 or 8 verses, so we have to go with it. This is a painting from Rembrandt. Who was one of the famous Dutch painters back in the 1600s. but it's called the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. Every one of these, I have shown you a picture, and I've told you that you can find this in such and such museum in such and such city. You can't find this one. This one was stolen in 1990 from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, couple things. First of all, Mary and I watched a show a couple years ago about that museum being broke into. If you have Netflix, I don't know if anybody does, but there's a 4-part series on Netflix called This Is a Robbery. And it's really good. It's really good. It's about these art pieces. There were 13 pieces of art in this museum that were stolen. 3 of them were Rembrandt pieces, and he's considered one of perhaps the greatest artists maybe ever. They are valued today, the 13 missing pieces, valued today at $600 million. What's missing? If you know anything about it, there is a $10 million reward if you can tell the police in Boston anything about it. I don't know. Who needs $10 million? You just want to hold on to them. I don't know. Y'all can make your own decision on that. This is the most valuable one. This singular piece is valued at $140 million. This one artistic piece. It was taken in 1990. A lot of speculation as to who it is. There's a lot of art theft that takes place. And the problem with stealing something like this, you can't really sell it. You kind of have it. It's kind of a mob thing as well. You get some of that as well, but you're sort of holding on to it. And I guess if you needed the 10 million, it could always, we could appear. But they really have no idea where this is. And this is perhaps because of that, but other reasons as well, one of his most famous works. But it's called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. I just want to tell you all that in case anybody's short on money. You'll find this, you can add up a little bit. What's that? Find it in the yard. Yeah, next time you go to a yard sale, put them old T-shirts and all that other stuff behind and see, you got any artwork hidden back here? Yes. That's the first person I looked at right there. So I figured we was 50-50 on Lucille having that right there. So, but anyway, let's get into this here just a little bit. This is Mark chapter 4 is where we're going to be. There's a couple of different reading parts of it right here. First of all, Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 38. Verse 35 through 38. Leland, would you care to read this for us, sir? Now, there's more to this, but we're stopping right there for just a minute to kind of set the stage, as it were, for where we were. So let's talk about a couple of things. First of all, after he speaks with this large group, and again, we've seen this over and over again, that Jesus was talking to these groups of people, and the groups of people just keep getting bigger, right? Lots of people that were there. Jesus proposes that he and the disciples do what in verse 35? He said, let's cross over to the other side. I don't know why. Doesn't really matter. But that was the proposal. Let's go over to the other side right there. Now, this is not a huge lake in the sense that, it'll take us 5 days to get across it. It's nothing like that. But that's what the game plan is doing so. But by doing this, what will he have to do with the multitudes of people that are there? You got to send them away, okay? You got to send them home. How many of you sometimes find yourself in need of removing yourselves from the crowd or from a group of people? Can we relate to this at times? Like, I just need to, I don't want to go to the store. I don't want to go to the market. I just want to go home, be by myself for just a little while. We can relate to that, right? Well, it's almost impossible for Jesus to do that, but you see it quite often in these miracle stories, especially that Jesus, it'll say that Jesus and his disciples or Jesus himself or Jesus and a couple of people or whatever, they'll go to the other side or they'll go to this place or to that place. Because even though Jesus's task was to preach and teach, every now and then you still get a little crowded, right? You still got people everywhere around you. And so he had to send the multitudes away. Now, they go on across the sea. Verse 37, what happens as they cross the sea in verse 37? Then it says a great windstorm arose. That's the word, right? So let's think back to the pictures in the map that we looked at a minute ago. It's almost certain that they would not have went across that water if there was a storm happening, right? So we look at this and we might say, wait a minute, there's a storm. Why would you go? Well, what did we learn about sort of the layout for the Sea of Galilee? Storm could happen really quick. This decision, we're going to go from here to the other side. There's a little bit of risk, but we probably need to get on it because you never know what's going to happen. Well, this windstorm arises as they go across the sea right there. How does it describe what happens in this storm? Just in verse 37. How does Mark describe verse 37? Waves beat into, not onto, but into. So water's coming in. What else does it say in verse 37? The boat was already filled. If I could remember who it was, I would tell you who it was. But I remember when we were really young, there was a preacher at Maple Avenue, and it was his gospel meeting, but I can't remember who it was. But he said, don't you know that there were probably people in that boat throwing water out saying, you're not throwing it as fast as, I can't remember who it was, but I remember him saying that. Sure as world. That's probably been 35 years ago or something, whenever it was. But when this water comes into the boat, what do you got to do? You got to get it out. Because let's go back and look at the boat that we were talking about a minute ago. How big is it? Pretty small, holding 15 to 20 people, but pretty crowded, right? What's going to happen to that boat when you've got 15 or 20 people in it and water coming in? It's going to go pretty quick. So you got to get that water out of there. And it's a situation where, do you go back? Do you go forward? Does it matter? You just got to get the water out and got to go. But the situation painted here is not one that seems very appealing, right? Most of you said, I don't want to be in that boat. Most of you just said, if it's coming a storm, I don't want to be in that boat. The boat is filling up and it's being hit from the side. I'll ask you one more time, who wants to be in that boat right there? What was Jesus doing? Verse 38. That seems odd, doesn't it? Because most of us have said, I don't want to be in there. But if we were in there, you might have passed out. You'd been so scared. That's about the only way that we could relate to it, right? But you might have been asleep. My sister could fall asleep in anything. We'd always talk about we'd go on vacation and Jess was asleep before we got to the end of the driveway. Like she never even made it onto the main road from when we'd go somewhere on a trip. You all know people that can sleep through anything, right? Jimmy says you can right there. You think you could have slept through this? Probably not, right? An open boat, this water coming in. Jesus, we read in verse 38, was asleep. So what do they ask him in verse 38? Yeah. So they said, do you not care that we are perishing? We are dying. Boat is sinking. We're going to go underwater. We are all going to die right here. And they said, do you not care that we're perishing? It's interesting because I'm not sure if that's the first thing I would have said. What do you think the first thing you would have said if while you're trying to bail out this boat and this storm is hitting you from all sides and you look to the stern, to the back, and this guy is sawing logs back there in the back? What's the first thing you would have said? Wake up. Help. You look like you're strong enough to man a bucket, right? We all probably could, but he's sound asleep, right? And they asked him, they said, do you not care that we perish? Or do you not care that we're all about to die, right? Well, that question is valid because it looks like he doesn't care. It's almost as if you look, he's made peace with the fact we're all just going to sink right here. Yes. 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 Right. Right. So they said, do you not care that we are perishing? Now, we've only seen Jesus say one thing in this segment of verses so far. All Jesus has said is what in verse 35? Let us go to the other side. Now, let's just be honest for a minute. We've only seen Jesus say that. Now, the boat's about to sink, and he's asleep. Do you think it's crossing anybody's head? You're the reason this is happening. Because nobody else said, let's go to the other side. Who said it? Jesus did. And so if we're not careful, we probably fall into some, like, we's fine on land. Everybody was fine. Nobody. And all of a sudden, well, we'll see what Jesus has to say because he's going to speak again going forward. This is now Mark 4, 39 through 41. 39 through 41. Ben, do you care to read that?
Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased there, great calm. But he said to him, are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? How can this be? Or who can this be? And the seas of that.
Okay. So after they wake Jesus, after they kind of fuss at him a little bit, or at least complain a little bit, then there is the response from him. Now, keep that set of verses there, but we'll look at a couple of questions. First of all, Jesus deals with what first in verse 39? He deals with the situation that's scaring him. He deals with the wind. He deals with the storm. He does not deal with their question first. But his first task, the first thing that we see Jesus do in verse 38 is what? All right. He arose, rebukes the wind. So he arose, rebukes the wind. The question says, what does he say there? I said 38, but it's verse 39. I'm sorry. Peace, be still. And what happens to the wind? It calms. Now, has Jesus dealt with the people yet? He dealt with the situation at hand. But by dealing with the situation at hand, what's he going to do for the people? Right. So if they had said, and they did say, do you not care that we are perishing? Jesus could have spun around to him and said, well, it's not that I don't care, but I think that, but what's happening to the boat during that time? It's still filling up with water. And like Ben said right there, they're not listening to him. It's like, boat's filling up, boat's filling up. You're getting that kind of thing right there. So he calms the sea situation first. After the storm then was calmed, this situation's good. Now then, Jesus is going to talk with the disciples, right? After we've got the trouble out of the way, now he talked with the disciples. And so what does he then ask his disciples? Okay. Now I want to look at both questions, but I don't want to look at them together. I want to look at the first question. And I'm going to we'll play act this just a little bit. I'm going to play the role of Jesus here, and I want you to play the role of the disciple, okay? I have a line, you don't have one. So you can make up your line. Why are you so fearful? Now, you're the disciple. I want you to answer that question as the disciple. I thought I was going to die. We are sinking. Maybe somebody said this is the worst thing. Did somebody say I can't swim? Who was that? Who was that? That's a problem for a lot of folks right here, right? Can't swim, right? How else might people have answered that question? Afraid I was going to drown. My family is back home, and they don't even know that we're on this. We can fill in that blank with a whole lot of things. But Jesus follows with the second question. And he says, what in the second question? He says, how is it that you have no faith? I said, I want to split those questions apart. They're there together. Jesus asking them in verse 40 when he says, why are you so afraid or so fearful?
Here's the phrase that perfect love casts out all fear. It's the same thing here. If you have love, faith, and trust in Jesus, he's got no reason to be afraid. No matter what life throws at you, what's the matter?
Right.
I'm with the Lord. What does it matter?
Right.
It doesn't matter if I lose my money. It doesn't matter if I lose my job, my health, whatever. I'm with Jesus.
Sure. Others. Say it again. If they had faith, they wouldn't have any fear. This is not the first miracle that we've seen Jesus perform, right? This is our 13th lesson. In fact, the reason that they went out to the other side was because what had gathered around them on the shore? The crowd. They were so overwhelmed with crowds. Like, we're going to go over to the other side, kind of calm the crowd down just a little bit. And so the disciples that are with him have clearly been with him for most, if not all, of these miracles that he's done. But faced with a problem that faces them, they immediately become sort of tore up. See, the demon-possessed man didn't really affect them, right? The widow whose son had died didn't really affect them. Peter's mother-in-law didn't really affect them. But what we see here is a situation where it affected them, right? Because it's their boat that's about to sink, and it's their life that's about to go over. And sometimes when it faces somebody else, it's easy to say, oh, you'll be fine. Cheer up. A little faith, that'll do you good. But when it faces us, what do we sometimes do? We sort of get afraid of what happened. Jesus said, how is it that you have no faith? You can sort of read into that sentence, you've been with me for a while now. I have fixed a lot of issues. Did you not believe that you could have fixed it, that I could fix this? It's interesting if you go back into the reading, it says in verse 37, a windstorm arose, waves were beating into the boat so that it was already filling. And then in verse 38, they wake him up. I don't know exactly how to read that, but it almost seems like they tried to maybe fix the situation themselves before they woke. Do we do that sometimes? Of course. What do they say to each other in verse 41? Absolutely so. Sure, Mary. Sure. Uh-huh. Absolutely. It's interesting that verse 40 and verse 41 both use the word fear. But Jesus in verse 40 says, why are you so fearful? And I think the fear that they were experiencing in verse 40 was, we're about to die, right? Boat's about to sink, I'm about to die. But verse 41, it says, and they feared exceedingly. What's the fear there? Maybe so. We use that term. We've used that term a few times here, sort of awestruck, sort of overwhelmed, sort of amazed, whatever word you want to use right there. It changes just a little bit. But it's interesting to me that these disciples say to one another, who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? Well, what has the comments been by almost everybody that Jesus had performed a miracle for. Not the disciples, but the people who'd been healed and the people that had demons cast out. How do they almost all respond? Gratitude, worship, the word fear, awestruck, amazement, like, wow. And many times Jesus told them, he said, don't go and tell, right? But what did they almost always do? They went and told because it was pretty crazy what they had seen. Again, been there for most, if not all of that. But in the same thing, they say, who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?
I think too that fear might be a good thing. They've seen all these things. Okay, well, he's a problem. He's this, he's that. And when he sees this, they're like, okay, something special is going on. It's like when first told Peter to cast out your net, and Peter says, "Get away from me, I'm a sinful man."
Right.
Somebody else. You see the same thing when Isaiah found himself in drink before God. Woe is me, for I'm done. I'm a man, unclean lips, and I'm here in the presence of God.
Right.
I think it is a scary thing when you realize, like, I'm right here in God's presence. God's right here with me, He sees me.
Right.
And sometimes our natural reaction, I'm not worthy. Let me get away, let me get myself fixed, and then come back.
I'm going to be gone the next 2 Wednesdays. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. I think it was kind of fitting that we stop here for a couple of weeks, if only because I think there is a change in the disciples a bit at this point. Now, we will still go further, and we will still see that the apostles they get confused what he was doing, but there's clearly sort of a hit home situation for these disciples that are with him right there in this. And again, there's still 21, 22 miracles or so still left to cover. But it's like there's a viewpoint maybe changes a little bit for the disciples right here. Thoughts about that? Yes.
I think that one thing that I take from it, this storm is real. Jesus is tired. He's in the boat. He went to sleep. And I think it shows how incredible great he is.
Sure.
Because he was in all points. He was just like we are. And he did not sin. He was tempted just like we were. And fears and temptation.
Sure.
I'm too afraid to do this. I'm too afraid to become a Christian. I'm too afraid. Jesus was not afraid. He
Right.
was a brave soul. Well, he knew what waited at the end of the line, but when's the end of the line coming? Would be at this point, would be, but I don't know if he knew that or not.
Right.
I can't say that. But I think it's one more reason to get fired.
Sure.
That's what we want out of our Savior. You don't want somebody that's timid or somebody scared.
Sure.
Like I take away a lot too is that if we focus on the storm instead of the Savior, we get better. It's like Peter when he was walking on water, when he was looking at Jesus, he was fine. But when he concentrated on the waves of the thing, same way with Isaiah, he said the earthquake, but God was not in it, for it's a great wind, but God wasn't in the wind, but finally that still small voice.
Right.
It's tempting to get caught up in the storms and the stuff that's going on around us, but we've got to just calm ourselves and look for Jesus and whatever's going on.
Other thoughts before we.
They've had bad storms, bad storms are coming. And not that we're not trying to be a little cautious or anything like that, or think it's silly. But we just say, well, we get blown away, we just get blown away. I mean, I'm not going to just sit around cringing in fear that it could come a tornado and hit my house and blow it away.
Right.
And it could. I'm not saying it could. But I'm just not going, I can't fret about that much.
There was a reason why I picked the reading that Jimmy did at the very start. In Psalm 46, verses 1, 2, and 3, if you don't remember it, you can turn back. But the first thing is, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. This is words of comfort because verses 2 and 3 are very similar to what we've just seen right here. Therefore, we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, the mountains be carried in the midst of the sea, the waters roar and be troubled, mountains shake. Really what they're saying is no matter what, earthquakes and wind and boats, all of these things will happen. But they say there at the beginning that they would find their refuge, safety with God. 3 things to leave with. Number 1, even followers of Jesus have problems. And I think that's important for us to think about. Just because we're followers doesn't mean that we won't have, what Ben said a minute ago, storms in our life, right? When trials and tribulations hit, Psalm 46 and verse 1 says, turn where? Turn to God, right? Turn to God. And so that, like Ben was saying there a minute ago, that can kind of provide a comfort for us during difficult times. Number two, and I think this is one that we sometimes struggle with the most, is don't panic if Jesus is silent. Even though Jesus was asleep in the boat, who was in control? Jesus was, right? Philippians chapter 4 and verse 7, you all probably know this, can remember this, but it says, the peace of God, which does what? Surpasses all understanding. Think about that verse in Philippians compared to the story that we just read. The peace of God, basically the ability for somebody to lay down and sleep when the boat's about to sink, surpasses all understanding. Can you relate to Jesus in this story? Can you relate to Jesus in the story of calming the sea? I don't think any of us can, because that's why I've asked you several questions throughout. Would you have liked to been here? Would you have been asleep? You can't relate to that, right? I cannot relate to being asleep in the boat in that situation. Yes. Sure. Right. Absolutely. That's Thank you. Exactly right. But that's why I was asking that at the beginning. Like when we're sitting here, comfortable building, comfortable seats, everything's going good. We look at that boat and like, oh, it sounds awful. I couldn't. But what if you're in the boat? You just say, well, you are. Exactly. We're always in the boat. We just don't sometimes know that we're in the boat. Uh-huh. Yeah. So then let's look at the third one then. And the third thought here is maybe sometimes we should learn to look back. And there's a whole sort of Lot's wife story here, right? Of not looking back. But that's not what I mean right here. In what we read, it said after Jesus calmed the storm, Mark says that the men feared exceedingly. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 27 says that the men marveled, amazed, whatever word you want to use right there is what happened. But they marveled, they feared exceedingly after the storm had ended, right? And so there was time. Now it almost seems like the storm's gone. We still got to take the boat the rest of the way across, but there was time for them to sort of think back like, what did we just experience? What did we just see right here? Well, for us, what Mary said there was very much right. You know, when you go through those difficulties, you know, when you maybe come out or it gets a little bit better, should we look back and say, look what we went through? Look what God has helped us with. Maybe this can be an inspiration or a help or a assistance for somebody else. I don't have all the answers, but maybe you're going to go through something that I went through a while back, and we can relate to it a little bit.
We're very, very forgetful people.
Yeah.
I had a friend at work had 5 heart attacks. And he would talk about how bad it was, but in a year or two removed from it, he was back to eating the same thing, he was doing the same thing in physical. He's forgot about the pain. Same way with a woman that has a baby. You know, going through all that pain, and after a few years, that pain left her mind.
Right.
Has another child and stuff like that. We're very forgetful people. It's the same way with God. When God delivers us or saves us and stuff, we have a tendency to forget about that and just focus on the now. And it's important to stop every now and then and just look back and see where all God has brought you.
Right. Other thoughts from anybody? I think that's a good sentence to end on with Ben. Any other?
Well, I had a couple different guys who showed me from place to place whenever I was hiking, and they would advise us hikers if they don't forget to look back. And sometimes you climb this monster hill 8 miles up or something like that. And when you got to the top, I look back on the wall, and I'm glad I made it.
Right.
That's hard. I mean, everything about it is hard. I'm dead, but I got that deal, and now it looks a little better for a while. And I think we need to do that even a lot. I've been through some of these bad mountains. And
Sure.
And I'm going to climb another one, rather than just go to pieces. We need to lean heavy on people.
Any other thoughts before we wrap up? Go.
Bracelet, that's what it's meant. It's the bracelet of a mountain chain. It's supposed to remind you that the same God that was God on the mountain, God is God in the valley.
Right.
And always look to God and trust in God in the matter.
Well, like I said, I don't know who's